Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Sky, and I'm on the marketing team here at Skyflow. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Things I Learned Building Data Privacy Vaults at Netflix. I'd love to introduce you to today's speakers. Joining us today, we have Jitender Aswani, who leads data science and engineering at MoveWorks, the lead market-defining conversational AI platform that delivers instant help at work. Before that, Jitender was head of infrastructure, security, and privacy data science and engineering at Netflix. His team designed, built, and deployed scalable privacy by default and zero trust big data solutions to enable engineering and operation teams to achieve consistent capacity, reliability, privacy, and security gains. He's also held data and product leadership roles at Facebook and SAP. Also joining us today is our co-founder and CEO, Anshu Sharma. Anshu is a serial entrepreneur and angel investor and has invested in over 25 startups. He co-founded Clearedin, where he serves as executive chairman, and Suki, a digital assistant for doctors. Before that, he served as venture partner at Storm Ventures and was a vice president of platform at Salesforce. All right, Anshu, you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you so much, Sky. Hey, Jitender, how are you doing? You're on mute, I think.
This is the Zoom problem, right? You start talking on mute. Anshu, I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me here. Also, Sky, thank you for your warm intro.
Well, thanks for making the time. So I think today's goal is to just have a conversation, as you know already, but some of others here don't know. When we started Skyflow, we were inspired by obviously the pain we saw at our customers when I was working at my previous company, Salesforce, where people were trying to handle sensitive data. But the inspiration for the solution came from a few leading companies. Apple, we know, has sort of a vault-like architecture. Google, we know, has a vault-like architecture, and Netflix was another one. And today's goal is just to learn, what we learned from you guys, share the learnings with everybody else, and make sure that we understand what is this zero trust data vault architecture, where did it come from, what were the pain and points that you were seeing. So that's the goal of the conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, Anshu, thanks for setting the context. And as you said, this problem is so prevalent in the industry. And I had, call it a good pleasure or good fortune of facing it twice in two big data companies that I worked at. So happy to share what I've learned from both Facebook and Netflix. Also happy to discuss any other questions the members or the participants might have.
Well, that's great. So I think the question that I asked you when we were preparing was like, nobody just wakes up one morning and says, hey, let's go and build a zero trust architecture with a vault and this and that. Like, what was the question that was being asked at the CEO level, the board level, the senior leadership level that drove a series of questions that resulted in a new solution for you guys?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question to kick off the conversation. As you said, nobody wakes up one fine morning and said, let's go build this thing. This has been constantly probing us. So at board level, at leadership level, one dreaded thing we always had is this New York Times test. For good reasons or bad reasons, no company wants to be on the front page of New York Times. I mean, you have seen some unfamous examples of companies who experienced painful data breaches, ended up being whiplashed in the popular media, especially New York Times. So that was our test as well, is that what do we need to do to avoid being on the New York Times front page? So that's basically is the New York Times test for us.
And I guess some of these New York Times headlines eventually resulted in some of these companies paying billions of dollars. But, more than the fines, it's also a reputational risk. So, as a loved brand, I think I go off to sleep every night pretty much watching some series or the other on Netflix. What was the impact on the brand that was at top of your mind for you guys when you were thinking about this problem?
Absolutely. Look, as you said, there is definitely monetary damage to the company's financials. But bigger than that is the trust subscribers and members have put in us. And we want to make sure that we don't breach that trust. We want to make sure that, as you said, you're sleeping peacefully, knowing that companies you have trusted your data with are good data guardians. They're doing everything in their power to safeguard that data. So that's our responsibility. That's my responsibility as a member of the data infra and data engineering team at Netflix is to make sure that we have the right safeguards in place, so we can continue to honor the trust subscribers have put in us.
So, should we look at the architecture you guys started with and get a sense of like where you started and how you eventually reached a conclusion on a new architecture pattern?
Yeah, let's do that. As we were constantly evaluating this New York Times test, we wanted to make sure that we can perform a sweeping audit across the company and identify architectures which we believe might be troublesome, which might potentially expose us to some kind of a privacy breach. And this is one of that architecture, right? I think it's quite apparent what's happening in this architecture. There are so many point-to-point connections. We have so many applications that are generating sensitive data. We have so many sources of data acquisition. And then each of these applications are talking to each other, and sensitive data and non-sensitive data is flowing back and forth, and there's no accountability or audit in place. So that's one. Two, internally, we're developing a lot of other applications on top of this data. And same thing, we have absolutely no policies and controls in place to ensure that these applications are allowed to access sensitive data. So that's very clear as well. The biggest problem for us was there was no single authoritative source of record. Like, there's so many data sources that are acquiring this data, but what's source of truth? What data should I trust? And if I build a finance application or a talent management application, or even a measuring like a data science application, we have no idea whether I can trust the underlying data. And also, what if the data had sensitive information? How do these applications scrub that out? So what was happening is that the privacy compliance and privacy implementation was being trusted upon these endpoints, as opposed to having a centralized solution. So that became a very big problem for us.
So every application engineer, somebody who's building a new app to watch TV shows together live, someone who's trying to figure out how to add sports app eventually, or whatever new application you're building internally or externally, the app engineer no longer has to just focus on building the app and the forms, but has to be sort of sophisticated in all the skills of data privacy.
Yeah, exactly. And you said it right. Like we expect people to specialize. If product developers, product engineers, product managers, they should focus on innovating around their own business model. And they should not be caught up in the whirlwinds of privacy. They should not be thinking about security of their data. They should not be thinking about, hey, is the data that's flowing from this application, from this data source to my application, is it encrypted? I have to worry about sensitive data coming into my application, right? No, actually, that should not be their burden. The burden belongs to centralized teams. The burden belongs to data guardians. Yeah. We have to make sure that we enforce these policies at a centralized place, so that endpoint owners are not responsible for worrying about data privacy and data security.
So kind of like how authentication moved to its own API, and in some ways data warehouses became sort of a shared service. So yes. Essentially you're talking about shared service architecture. 15 years ago, we would call this SOA. Is that basically the
exactly same architecture, right? Just as you said, privacy as a service, start with zero trust approach. That was exactly one of our design principles. And you're right, Okta is our identity management system. If you think about infrastructure, we don't let application owners to go manage infrastructure. We have centralized team that help them identify what are their infrastructure needs and how you should scale and how you don't have to worry about scaling up, scaling down. Very similar principle for privacy. Privacy now, especially in the last few years, has become an infrastructure need. Privacy was always addressed as a point solution. No longer it's a point solution. And it required taking a centralized approach. And that's what you've seen big companies that have the resources and wherewithal, they took that approach. It's like privacy should not be embedded in each application. Not each application owner should be responsible for having their own interpretation of what privacy means. You should not have lawyers talking to product managers and application developers. That's a bad thing, because that starts stifling the innovation.
Yeah, we call it the Ocean's 11 problem. In order to write a new application, you shouldn't have to assemble 11 people in a room, one lawyer, one security engineer, one database engineer. So looks like you understood the problem. You guys figured out that it's like one of the biggest challenges on the downside, and even actually on the upside, because trust is probably one of the core values for you guys, just as it was for us at Salesforce and other companies. So what did the path to solution look like? You started out by aligning and sort of agreeing on what the right solution would be, and then came to a new architecture?
Yeah, exactly. So one of Netflix core values is highly aligned, loosely coupled, which basically means that all these teams should debate what's the best thing to do for Netflix. So what we started doing, talk to various application owners and start disclosing what are the potential pitfalls and vulnerabilities that exist in this architecture. By the way, there is no architecture. This is not called an architecture. This has just grown out of need. There was no intentional thought applied. So what we're saying now is, let's be intentional about this architecture. Let's apply some rigor. Let's align on some core design principles. Let's make sure that everyone's use cases are addressed. Nobody should feel that their concerns were not addressed. And let's also ensure that as endpoint owners, you don't have to be responsible for data governance. This should be completely detached and abstracted away from you. So a lot of effort. This is a lot of effort. I want to make sure that the participants understand internally aligning on a centralized data architecture to improve data governance is a lot of effort. And you want to make sure you do that, because ultimately you want to build an extensible architecture. Anytime you're building infrastructure layers, you would like to have a lot of alignment inside your organization.
So you did that, you got aligned, you said, hey, look, let's have a sort of a shared API or a shared vault, and you started realigning around it. So what did the new architecture look like, and what was the transformation like?
Yeah, so once everyone was aligned and understood the benefits of this data architecture, right, we said, okay, let's review this. And it's very easy when you have engineering teams. They all have their own design principles. So we'll put a data architecture together, and we'll make sure that we incorporate your design principle. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest pain point in the previous architecture was there was no authoritative source of truth. So that was a big problem. Nobody trusted the data in their application. So I said, well, that clearly means that we should have a centralized data vault. Not only we will have a single authoritative source of truth, we'll also be able to enforce privacy and security guidelines. Right? So it became very clear. That was one of the principles. Right? We also said that in the vault, we will only store facts. In vault, we're not storing behavioral data. That is stored in some other places, right? And then we also aligned on how will you access data from vault. Certain applications will be writing to the vault, and certain applications will be reading from the vault. And we have to determine which applications assumes what role, which developers assumes what role. So we debated heavily on role-based access controls. We also determined that sometimes role-based access controls are not enough. We also need policy-based access controls. So applications should assume policies, And depending upon the use case, they can change what access controls they have. So we debated a lot on this, and we came together with some design principles that are listed here. And we also made sure that there are other applications that can take the fact data, which is available in the vault, and then create other enriched facts or summary data on top of that and make it available for other applications. So you see, it became very clear on the left side, you have sources from where we acquire data, and also the data gets mutated by sources on the left. Sources on the endpoints on the right is all about building internal application. So we can do better talent management. We can do better contract management. We have ML applications that allow us to understand what content, what talent, and what is the best way to go and acquire that talent and content.
So once you've done this transformation, if I'm an employee working in the talent team and I'm trying to figure out, who is the ideal actor for this new TV series, I'm able to analyze it without actually seeing the details of that person's PII, essentially.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as much as possible, we started abstracting away the sensitive data, but without stifling, without stopping the innovation, without stopping employees getting their questions answered.
So you may be able to run an analysis on partially redacted data, anonymized data. Maybe you came to the conclusion for this TV series, I need to go out and reach out to these 8 people, because you've not just done a one-way, sort of classical ETL kind of a role. You can actually go back and say, hey, now I know these 8 people should be in the series. Can I have the permission to actually find their phone numbers or email addresses and contact them?
Absolutely, absolutely. So we had various algorithms to do data anonymization. In some cases, you can do what you folks are doing very well is polymorphic anonymization, depending upon what type of field that is. Once we have identified what type of field it is, like, let's anonymize it in a way that people don't lose the context. Otherwise, what happens, all fields look exactly identical. Then you have no idea what kind of analysis you should do on these kinds of fields. So it was very clear that redaction alone will not work. So we should be focusing on different types of masking. We should be able to enable different applications to also decrypt the data, depending upon what policies and what access controls they have been granted. So it became very simple. And also, if you're a new application developer, you don't have to go to 10 different applications and align and identify what data to acquire. Data discovery on top of data vault also became very simple. So
I guess Jeff Bezos was right about service API-based architecture 18 years ago.
Yeah, ultimately our goal was to improve velocity.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, our goal was that each of these business owners, they should not be having, as you said, 10,000 conversations. To just understand where the data is coming from and then have their own data modeling, have their own data masking and data encryption. It all became simple.
Yeah. So let's say, not everybody here listening to the webinar is Netflix. Let's say I'm building a credit card company. Let's say I'm building a ride sharing company. Let's say I'm building, I'm a movie theater online. How does your architecture, how should they think about it? Like, how are they starting? Are they saying, look, we have each of these companies has some set of users. So today Robinhood went public. Let's say they have 20 million users. If you were building the architecture for Robinhood, just walk me through a very high level of like, hey, this is where you start. And these are the 2 or 3 things you may be thinking about and worrying about, including maybe data residency and GDPR.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think folks know this is a sequential process. Once you have identified the problem, once you have aligned on the solution, you have an architecture in place, implementation is hard, right? Devil is in the details, as everyone says. So once you have a green light, let's go build this. Well, you start thinking, should we build this from scratch? What's available internally? What's available externally? So you start into this discussion of, is there an off-the-shelf solution we can pick? Is there one or multiple solutions we need to pick? Fortunately, at our company, we have done this in few environments. We have few segregated environments. We call them segs. So we have subscriber data, we have payments data. Payments data is in a segregated environment. It's PCI compliant. What are the best practices that exist? Let's say you're not Netflix. You start asking questions, what are the best practices that exist out there? Like, I think I have a use case for data vault, right? How do I get it validated? So you start researching, you start saying, okay, what are the best practices? Once you understood the best practices, you start identifying the pieces of your architecture that should be powered by certain technologies. So you go into this debate, right? How do you decide? Let's say you're not a big company and you don't have the building blocks in place. Or even if you're a big company, you have certain building blocks in place, but those building blocks will not help you achieve or materialize the architecture we just talked about. You start evaluating, is there something available in open source community? We take immense pride, right? But so that's the process you go through. Build, buy, assemble, right? Should I buy an integrated solution? So that's the approach you go through.
So let's start with the easiest or the most common one, which is, obviously Skyflow didn't exist and a lot of people don't know about Skyflow, but there's dozens, if not hundreds of products in the security data management space. Can I just take what I have and maybe buy a few other things and put it together?
Absolutely.
What would it take, and sort of what's the upside and the downside to taking that approach?
Yeah, you're right. There are both upsides and downsides. So, for example, we have one of the best data engineering. So we had a lot of this data mapping that existed. We also had access control existed. We just have to morph it to our use case, right? We also have to figure out, okay, we got access controls for our data warehouses. We have access controls for data lakes. But when we put this data vault, is data vault based on an RDS? Is data vault based on a key value store? Right? How will we actually do it? Is it simple? Is it Cassandra? Is it DynamoDB? Right? So you have to start at a very high level when you really start thinking about these things. Okay, so I think we have RDS solutions available. The biggest gap that we saw is, okay, what is that software module or package that understands the changing privacy law across the globe? The GDPR and CCPA, and Brazil had its own implementation of GDPR. India had its own version of GDPR. So how do you build a data vault that can honor all of these privacy laws across the globe? So all of these, and API security is another thing, is that, okay, well, all of these applications can read data using APIs, but how do you enforce RBAC, which is role-based access control, or policy-based access control on top of these APIs, right? How do you make sure that every time an API talks to the data vault, it's securely exchanging the token that is allowed to access this data, right? For us, everything runs in a single VPC, but if you have applications that are outside of that VPC, how do you enable those VPCs? And you also listed key management, right? A lot of applications, we make sure that applications have their own keys. So we don't have a single key, which encrypts and decrypts data. Applications have their own keys, and we can centrally control those keys. We can either decommission those keys, we can provision new keys, we can change the access controls on those keys. So there are so many moving parts to this. As a data infrastructure owner or as a data guardian, you have to figure out, how do you do all of this? There are 10,000 things that you have to consider when you start implementing the architecture you have in mind. Architecture is so simple to build, honestly. You can get an architecture, a blueprint from anywhere. But when you start implementing, when you start identifying what does it take to implement, then it becomes very, very hard.
And so is that what leads to your question? Like,
absolutely.
So, you heard about us maybe, I don't know, 6 months ago, a year ago. I think we met through some common investors and such. What was your initial reaction? And like, I guess this question kind of represents some of that thinking, but you had been building, you had been probably helping other companies think through this problem. What was your initial reaction to like our approach?
Yeah, my first impression was, wow. Honestly, wow, right? There are a few pieces in your architecture that we didn't consider, right? And I think I can defend myself why we didn't consider, because you have been talking to hundreds of customers out there, and you have built a more comprehensive architecture than what we did. We believed the architecture we had was as robust, as complete as possible, because that was addressing our needs. That was one. Two, the flexibility in your architecture. It's very complete. It's very robust architecture, but also the flexibility that, okay, right? I can plug and play, right? I can also start small. And then as my data privacy needs evolve, I can continue to move up. So the elasticity that existed in your architecture, right? Something we have to think from day one. But let's say if I were to come across your architecture, your service earlier, it's like, oh, that's all right. I think what's available now is great. And I think it's going to extend with the evolution we will see in our use cases. And not just the evolution of the use case alone, but the evolution of privacy laws across the globe. So that's another thing, is that completeness was there. What I know from our conversations, the reliability is quite high. And then extensibility. I think you should consider all of these options as you start building your own vault, or as you consider other vault options, is that completeness, elasticity / flexibility, reliability / robustness.
So, we can play a buzzword bingo game here, but, if you could take one or two features here that, really speak out to you, we won't spend all the time, meditating on this slide, although, I obviously have an affection for it. I think, as you pointed out, this is all we do. We have a team of 40 plus engineers now, I think close to 50 soon. And each engineer wakes up every day and only works on this. And I don't know how many engineers you had dedicated to your solution internally at Netflix, but at least at large companies I've worked with before, large cloud companies, if I could get 4 engineers working for 3 months, that'd be a lot. More often than not, this is like 1 or 2 persons' second most important job.
That's so true. So to answer your first question, what's most striking in this architecture? And I'll say, look, I mean, you need everything that's available here. I can't pick and choose. I need all of these components to build a more complete, more comprehensive data privacy vault. Right? What's exciting to me is the dynamic nature of policies. The bottom layer, not the platform layer, but the layer on top, is that how is that layer going to evolve as the privacy laws across the globe evolve, right? We had a lot of help from a very capable legal team, privacy law team, that helped us understand how to interpret this law, how to interpret that law, right? That's one area where I believe the speed and agility of a software can really, really help.
Yeah, I mean, one of our customers, is a clinical trials company, right? And I remember talking to their legal firm. There's a legal firm team with a outside counsel. There's a security team with an outside security consultant. And there's compliance team with an outside auditor. And then there is the poor developer who's just trying to build better clinical trial applications. And then there's a machine learning team that just wants to figure out better drugs for us based on this data. and maybe even share the data with third parties based on anonymization. So I think what we found was oftentimes they're leaning on us for advice on what does Schrems 2 interpretation of GDPR for data that's resident in UK but shared with somebody in Ireland mean. And even those everything has to be sort of thought through. And, in our case, we have a paper available on our website, I think, where we basically say, hey, this is the official document from ENISA, which is the official EU organization. This is what it maps to, and this is how you can implement it. Or this is what CCPA says. And if you can turn on these 3 knobs, then you should be in compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you want to make sure that this cross-functional team that's working, if you're developing this internally and you're picking off-the-shelf technologies, you want to make sure that this cross-functional team is able to understand each other, right? That's why it's so hard. Otherwise, what happens is that a lot of this context is lost in translation. You can't have your legal team work directly with engineering team. That's very, 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 very hard. I'm not saying it cannot be done. It can be done, but it's a huge, huge time sink for both teams.
So, one of the other things we've, worked on a little bit is these pre-built integrations, with things like Twilio, with credit card processors and such. What's your thought on this idea of taking these data types and thinking through the external integrations and baking them in?
I will say it's you can do it. Nothing is impossible, but I'm pretty sure all of you or all of us are under tremendous time pressure. In addition to that, all of us also have responsibility as engineering leaders to think about solutions that will scale with our needs, not scale with their needs. So you can do a lot of these things, but I'll always recommend is that take a long view and make design choices with those long-term decisions you want to make. I always say play the long game. Privacy is the long game. You can't make shortcuts here, which basically means that because shortcuts are very, very expensive. That's why I stated that earlier, is that I wish there was an off-the-shelf solution available that addresses all our needs out of the box. Now, that's near impossible, but I think that's what you're trying to do, is do the impossible. So,
well, I think we're just taking what you guys built and what we built at Salesforce and a few other places and saying, look, none of these things individually is by itself complete rocket science.
I don't know.
But it's really the making it work. When I change a policy, how does the audit and logging policy affect it? Right. Or if the law changes and says, okay, data residency now includes IP addresses, which is what happened a couple of years ago. People used to say IP addresses are not PII.
Yeah.
They became PII. Now, overnight, you're trying to figure out what are the downstream implementation.
Exactly.
And if you have it distributed across these 15 data stores in your case, and I've actually met customers with like 400 databases. And these are like their OLTP databases, and then they have copies and OLAP copies and data science copies, and it's just a data sprawl. So I think we touched on this point, so probably not go into it again, but when we thought about like what would it take a team internally at a company like Netflix or Apple, Google, or your tiny startup, it basically was very clear to me that it required a very, very wide set of skill sets. Exactly. And is that one of the motivations for you in saying, hey, look, building may be harder than you think?
Yeah, as I said, we at Netflix, we take a lot of pride in doing it ourselves. We're aware that we're playing the long game, but we also know that it takes lots of different skill sets to do this. So this is not a complete list. But just to do this, you're looking at data engineers, you're looking at platform engineers, you're also looking at product engineers, you're looking at security, privacy engineers, you're looking at some data scientists, you also need product managers, you also need program managers. Of course, you need lawyers, you need other leaders in the mix. So it takes a very, very diverse village to build something like this. And it's multi-million, multi-year effort. Multi-million, multi-year effort.
Wow. So millions of dollars, many years. And, at least in my experience, it's also the hardest team to recruit for. Nobody's getting promoted if you're working at a rideshare company because you figured out policy-based access control better than neighbor.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's absolutely true. Another reason to think about this is such a hard problem is, this may not be the core focus. The reason Robinhood exists is they want to focus on democratizing investments, right? Empowering retail investors. Should they be spending millions of dollars and millions of hours on building a data vault? So at Netflix, yeah. So we just
have some questions popping up. I think we are running a little bit, few minutes over. So I think, I don't want to belabor this point, but essentially you have three choices. You can either, buy something like Skyflow. Hopefully in a few years, there'll be more competitors because then it'll be category. You can build your own, or you can basically go with the best of breed assemble path. So why don't we take a few questions and see, what people have questions.
Thank you, guys. That was great. If you want to go to the next slide, everyone can see your contact info in case any other questions come up that we don't get to in this session. So first question we have is, can you define what zero trust design means in context of a data vault, and perhaps even what is a data vault?
Sure. Why don't I take zero trust and you take data vault? So zero trust is a very simple principle. If you've ever been living in a new city, or like me, you're an immigrant, when you initially go to a new place, you don't know anybody. And you don't presume someone shows up in a uniform. You don't know the difference between a postman and a cop. And zero trust is simply the principle that we can no longer just assume that applications, users, machines that are within our data center or within some notion of a firewall are all trusted individuals, trusted machines, trusted systems, because, with the move to the cloud, but also work from home, and the network has disappeared. The internet is the network on which companies are operating. So every company is now a global company. Every people are working from home. So you can no longer say, well, this database is secure because, anybody who touches it coming from within our network. Zero trust is this broad idea that on every interaction, it's kind of like someone comes to your house. You don't assume who they are. You say, hey, show me your ID. Oh, looks like it says you're from FedEx, or it says you're a cop. Well, now you're authorized to do the following interactions with me. And zero trust is this simply idea that let's make sure that we verify who is asking for what at what time and is authorized for what. The challenge obviously is it's very, very hard to implement. I think only a handful of companies have implemented zero trust meaningfully today. Jitender?
Yeah, and just to extend Anshu's point, now, if you have to implement zero trust policies for all your applications, for all the actors in your organization, you start thinking in terms of, okay, what does it mean? So you take your sensitive data and you put it in a centralized data store, and you start applying these granular access controls, and you make these access controls very, very dynamic. And that's exactly what comes out, a vault, right? You also understand whether the data should be persisted in clear text, whether the data should be encrypted at rest, whether the data exchange between different actors and the vault, is it also secure, right? And should they be able to see all data? And that's where the granularity in access control comes in. So you take a zero trust. Zero trust literally means that I don't trust you. You tell me who you are. And then if you have a policy, you show me your policy, then I will grant you the access. And the policy will dictate what kind of access you have to the data.
So basically,
exactly
policy-based access control essentially implemented to its full results in zero trust.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. What's the next question,
All
Sky?
right. We have several questions around how difficult it is to implement something like Skyflow and how long it would take.
Awesome. So, I think since, I interact with Skyflow customers, I can share our perspective. I think there are three classes of customers. One is cloud savvy companies that are used to having a microservices or API-based architecture. For them, it's as simple as turning on one more API, right? They're used to using Twilio, they're used to using multiple data stores, they're using Auth0, they understand it, they can fully implement it. They can get up and running in a few hours with us, and then depending on how long it takes for them to build the application, they can go GA. We've had customers go live with us in as few as a few days. There's a second category of companies that have, a more extensive data architecture. Maybe it includes not just the application, but also an analytical solution like a data warehouse, kind of like where Netflix was, where Jitender was sharing, right? It's more than just a few apps. In that case, there's a bunch of work involved on the company side to figure out where you want to get started, right? You don't have to build all of this on top of a centralized API on day one. You can say, hey, we're going to start off with a vault for XYZ. I'm sure Jitender can explain how they went about it, but essentially app by app or data store by data store. And then there is a third category that frankly takes, 3 months or more, which is you are a last generation, data center centric company. You're beginning to experiment with the public cloud. You don't quite know. There's a lot of learning for you to understand what the cloud-based services, APIs and stuff. And frankly, I think those are the kind of companies that probably require an SI to get involved and help them. Jitender, over to you. What advice would you have for companies and timeline it takes to adopt?
I'll just re-emphasize, like as an engineering leader, you have a long-term view on this. You likely have an 18 months roadmap. So start small. Start with the use cases that you think are urgent, critical. You want to address them now. Look at a solution like Skyflow and say, okay, can I get out of the gate? Can I get these use cases addressed? And just focus on those use cases, but continue to keep your eyes on the long-term view that you have in mind. So just start small. I would like to get this done. I'll give you an example. For us, before we went down this path, it was very, very critical for us to address certain provisions of CCPA, actually GDPR. It was right to access. And a lot of companies like Facebook and Apple and others have already come out and they've already delivered services with right to access. So what right to access basically means is that as a subscriber or as a customer of your company, I have right to access all my data. So you should give me my data within 24 hours, right? So I think it's 24 hours. I may be missing the time period.
Different geos have different geos. Hours.
So, and I imagine, right? You have to build an application that should do this. And you need to know where is all the data. As Anshu mentioned, some of his customers have 400 databases. We are a large company. Our infrastructure is also pretty complex and spread out. Just knowing where the data is, right? So maybe you can start by just building a data catalog first, and then identifying where in your data catalog you have sensitive data before you move that sensitive data over to the wall. So you can think about phasing your project. So we first focused on right to access. Let's solve that problem, because if we don't do that, it hurts our credibility as a brand.
We've also seen customers say, my biggest blocker right now is data residency. So can I take PII and store it in 3 different geos? And for now, that means 3 fields. And I'm not really changing my architecture fundamentally because most of the architecture stays the same. I'm just replacing your phone number, credit card number, and your national ID number with anonymized basically views that are getting into your core databases. Or people saying, I'll just do PCI, right? PCI compliance is 6 months project for most companies. And, can I just get credit card number API? So there are point solutions to point problems with the goal of having, sort of this universal API eventually that works across all use cases or many use cases and many applications.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're at time. So if you have any questions that we weren't able to get to today, or you think of anything else, please feel free to reach out to us directly. You can go to skyflow.com for more details, or email us at hello@skyflow.com. Thank you so much again for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thanks, Jitender. Thank you so very much for sharing your experiences and being so open about it. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for hosting me, Anshu, and thank you all.
Of course. Bye.